Weight loss solutions are not one size fits all. Hers makes it simpler to get started and stick with a weight loss plan, backed by expert-guided online care that puts your weight loss goals first. These include oral medication kits or compounded GLP-1 injections. Through Hers, pricing for oral medication kits start at just $69 a month for a 10-month plan when paid in full upfront. No hidden fees, no membership fees. You shouldn't have to go out of your way to feel like yourself. Hers brings expert care straight to you with 100% online access to personalized treatment plans that put your goals first. Reach your weight loss goals with help through Hers. Get started at forhers.com/4u to access affordable, doctor-trusted weight loss plans. That's forhers.com/4u, forhers.com/4u. Paid for by Hims and Hers Health. Weight loss by Hers is not available everywhere. Compounded products are not FDA approved or verified for safety, effectiveness, or quality. Prescription required. Restrictions at forhers.com apply.
Love horror movies, haunted houses, creepy cult classics? Love a good drink while you scream? Then you need to check out Spooky Sips, the podcast where three spooky-loving ladies dive into horror movies old and new, all while sipping on some delicious spirits of their own. From slashers and slow burns to final girls and found footage, they bring the laughs, the screams, and the cocktails every 2 weeks. So grab your glass, hit play, and join the watch party because horror is better with friends, and maybe a little wine. New episodes every other Thursday. Listen to Spooky Sips wherever you get your podcasts.
Time is not a line. It folds, it loops. It hides in places we haven't yet learned to look. We measure it with clocks and calendars, but those are just tools, like trying to chart the ocean with a ruler. Space behaves no better. It stretches and bends, sometimes violently, sometimes so subtly we don't notice until something is missing. The rules we think we know are only true until they aren't. And when they break, they usually don't break quietly.
Welcome to Down the Crooked Path. I'm your host, Amanda Joy. Join me as we dive into eerie and spine-chilling stories that blur the lines between reality and the unknown. From cryptids and mysterious disappearances to true crime, UFO sightings, and paranormal activity. Venture into the unknown and uncover the secrets that lie down the crooked path.
There are stories, whispers really, about moments when space and time did behave. Not in ways that science predicts and not in ways that we expect. These stories don't come from textbooks. They come from classified memos, from sailors who swore that they saw something vanish, from witnesses who were told they hadn't seen anything at all. They come from places where the air feels wrong, where the compass spins, and where people remember things that never officially happened. One of those stories begins in 1943. A ship, a test, and a result that no one to this day can fully explain. What followed was buried, denied, and then, like all good secrets, was leaked. Not all at once, but just enough to make you wonder if the laws of physics are more flexible than anything we are comfortable admitting. In the shadows of World War II, beneath the thunder of artillery and the drone of bombers, another war was unfolding. One fought in laboratories, bunkers, and secret facilities. It was the war of invention, of ideas sharpened into weapons, of science twisted into strategy. And while those battles raged across the continent, behind closed doors, minds were racing towards something far more devastating than bullets. In 1939, German physicist Otto Hahn discovered induced nuclear fusion. That same year, Albert Einstein signed a letter to President Roosevelt warning that Nazi Germany might be developing an atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project was born soon after, a sprawling network of scientists and engineers working in isolation across sites like Los Alamo and Oak Ridge. Their goal was to harness the power of the atom, and by July 1945, they succeeded. The Trinity test, detonated in the New Mexico desert, unleashed a force equivalent of up to 20,000 tons of TNT. Less than a month later, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were reduced to ash, and over 200,000 lives were lost. The war ended, and a new era began. But the race for supremacy didn't stop at nuclear power. Radar, once a theoretical concept, became a divisive tool. British scientist Robert Watson Watt had demonstrated its feasibility in 1935, and by 1940, a chain of radar stations lined the coast of Britain, allowing the Royal Air Force to intercept German bombers before they reached their targets. In the Atlantic, radar equipment destroyers hunted U-boats with chilling precision. The technology saved lives, and it also made killing more efficient. Cryptography turned intelligence into a weapon. The German Enigma machine encrypted messages with near impossible complexity. At Bletchley Park, Alan Turing and his team worked around the clock to break these codes, and they succeeded. Their work helped shorten the war, but it came at a cost. The secrecy surrounding Bletchley meant that many of its contributors died without recognition, and their stories were buried beneath classified files. Medicine also advanced rapidly during this time. Penicillin was mass-produced for the first time and saved countless soldiers from infection. But not all medicine progress was humane. In Nazi concentration camps, doctors conducted experiments on prisoners, freezing them, injecting them, dissecting them alive. These were not treatments, they were tests of sorts. The goal was to understand human limits, to push boundaries of survival, and the victims were stripped of their names and reduced to data points. There was machine evolution as well. The war began with cavalry and trenches, and it ended with jet aircrafts, ballistic missiles, and atomic bombs. German V-2 rockets, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, struck London with terrifying speed. Its development relied on forced labor from concentration camps. Thousands died building it, and the weapon was hailed as revolutionary. Even ideas became weapons. The Allies targeted enemy research facilities with surgical precision. Operation Most 3 aimed to capture secrets of the German V-2. Uval raid sought to steal radar technology. Sabotage missiles disrupted heavy water production in Norway, crippling Nazi nuclear ambitions. Scientists were smuggled in and out of occupied territories, and others were silenced. World War II was not just a clash of armies, it was a crucible of innovation where progress and horror walked hand in hand. Every breakthrough carried a shadow, every invention had a cost. And while the war ended in 1945, the consequences of that technological race were still unfolding. This is because governments weren't just chasing weapons, they were chasing possibilities, and fringe science crept into the conversation. Nazis poured resources into eccentric resources like psychic warfare, anti-gravity propulsion, and even time manipulation. Most of it never left the drawing board, but certain details may have been unfounded. Nonetheless, the rumors continued to circulate, fostering a climate of suspicion that persisted beyond the conclusion of the war. Nearing the war of World War II, Albert Einstein was no longer working on weapons. He had distanced himself from the Manhattan Project, having signed a letter that helped initiate it, but later expressed deep regret over its consequences. By then, his focus had shifted entirely. He was chasing something else, something that he believed could explain everything. It was called the unified field theory, and it consumed him. After revolutionizing physics with general relativity in 1915, Einstein spent the last 3 decades of his life pursuing a single elegant idea: that gravity and electromagnetism weren't separate forces, but two manifestations of a deeper, unified structure. He believed that the universe, at its most fundamental level, was governed not by a patchwork of laws, but by a single geometric framework. If successful, his theory would not only unify the known forces, but would redefine the very language of physics. Now, the groundwork for this vision had already been laid. In the 1800s, James Clerk Maxwell had unified electricity and magnetism into a single electromagnetic field. Einstein's own work had shown that gravity was not a force in the Newtonian sense, but the cultivation of space-time itself. Now he wanted to go further. He believed that both gravity and electromagnetism could be derived from the geometry of space-time, if only the right mathematical structure could be found. Einstein wasn't alone in this pursuit. Theodore Kazusa proposed a 5-dimensional model in which electromagneticism emerged naturally from the geometry of the extended space-time. Hermann Weyl attempted to generalize space-time using scaled invariance, while Arthur Eddington explored asymmetric metrics that could encode both gravitational and electromagnetic effects. Einstein studied their work, redefined their ideas, and published his own versions, but none of them held up under scrutiny. The math was elegant, but the predictions didn't match reality. One of the major obstacles was Einstein's refusal to incorporate quantum mechanics. He distrusted its random nature and rejected its indeterminism. To Einstein, the universe was fundamentally ordered, and any theory that relied on randomness was incomplete. This was a philosophical stance that isolated him from the mainstream physics community, which was rapidly embracing quantum theory and building the foundation of what would become the Standard Model. While younger physicists were exploring quantum electrodynamics and particle interactions, Einstein was working alone, scribbling equations that stretched across dozens of pages, searching for a deterministic bridge between gravity and electromagneticism. Central to his efforts was the metric tensor, the mathematical object that describes the shape and curvature of space-time in general relativity. Einstein believed that if he could manipulate this tensor just right, the equations of electromagnetism would emerge naturally from the same structure that described gravity. He tried countless variations, altering the geometry, introducing new dimensions, asymmetric metrics. Each time something broke, the equation failed to produce consistent results, or they contradicted known observations. The math just wouldn't hold. When Albert Einstein died on April 18, 1955, he left behind more than a legacy. He left behind a trail of unfinished work. Among his personal papers at the Institute for Advanced Studies were stacks of handwritten notes and manuscripts, many of them devoted to his decade-long pursuit of a unified field theory. These documents, later archived and studied, revealed a mind still deeply engaged with the mysteries of space-time and geometry. Although the theory remained unfinished, his work demonstrated the unwavering resolve that characterized his career, a conviction that the universe is comprehensible through reason, structure, and redefined mathematical principles. While his last equation did not provide a solution, they ensured that the inquiry would still continue. In the final years of Nikola Tesla's life, the line between genius and myth began to blur. He had already changed the world with ideas and creations surrounding alternate currents, radios, remote control, and fluorescent lighting. But the rumors that followed him into obscurity weren't about what he had done. They were about what he might have done. Tesla believed that energy didn't need wires. He had envisioned a global system where electricity could be transmitted through Earth's atmosphere, reaching homes, machines, even ships at sea. In 1901, he began building the Wardenclyffe Towers in Shoreman, New York, a massive structure designed to transmit power wirelessly using the Earth itself as a conductor. Backed initially by financier J.P. Morgan, Tesla imagined a network of towers encircling the globe, each capable of broadcasting energy and information through the atmosphere. He believed that the planet itself could resonate with electric energy, creating standing waves that could be tapped into anywhere on Earth. The project faltered. Morgan, interested in radio communication rather than global power distribution, withdrew funding when Tesla explained the scope of the towers beyond its original purpose. Additional investments never materialized. By 1906, the towers were abandoned, and Tesla mortgaged the property. In 1917, the structures were demolished for scrap metal. The dream was shelved, and Tesla's reputation began to fade, not because he lacked vision, but because the world wasn't ready to follow him into that vision. Still, this science wasn't fiction. Tesla's experiments with high-frequency currents and resonant inductive coupling laid the groundwork for technologies that wouldn't be realized until nearly a century later. His work in Colorado Springs demonstrated wireless transmissions over short distances, and while the efficiency dropped sharply with range, the principle was sound. Today, companies like EMROD and Reach Power are developing systems that beam electricity through microwaves and radio waves with up to 95% efficiency, using satellites, lasers, and atmospheric relays to do what Tesla had once imagined. Now, the rumors for teleportation are different, as they didn't come from Tesla's notebooks. They came from conspiracy theories. In 1943, shortly after Tesla's death, the U.S. government did seize his papers under the Alien Property.
Lowe's knows how to get you ready for holiday hosting with up to 35% off select home decor. And get up to 35% off select major appliances. Plus, members get free delivery, haul-away, basic installation, parts, and a 2-year Lowe's protection plan when you spend $2,500 or more on select LG major appliances. Valid through 10/1. Member offer excludes Massachusetts, Maryland, Wisconsin, New Jersey, and Florida. Installed by independent contractors. Exclusions apply. See Lowe's.com for more details.
Custodian, a legal mechanism used during wartime to secure assets of foreign nationals. Tesla was a U.S. citizen at the time. His suburban heritage and the sensitive nature of his work prompted this action. The seizure itself is documented, and what happened next, though, is not. Some claim Tesla's research was used in a secret Navy experiment that is known as the Philadelphia experiment, where a ship was allegedly rendered invisible or teleported. There is no evidence that Tesla was involved, no verified documents linking him to the project. The story surfaced decades later, fueled by hearsay, pseudoscience, and the allure of suppressing technology. Tesla never claimed to have worked on teleportation. He spoke of energy, vibrations, and reconnaissance, not displacement through space. What is true is that Tesla's ideas were decades ahead of their time. He believed that the Earth could be used as a conductor, that energy could be drawn from the atmosphere, that machines could operate without fuel. And while some of his claims were exaggerated, such as his belief of limitless free energy, many were rooted in real physics, and the rest became legend. By the time of his death, Tesla was living alone in a New York hotel room, feeding pigeons and scribbling notes on cosmic rays and wireless energy. He had become a recluse, but not a forgotten one. The FBI had opened a file on him. The scientific community remained divided. Some saw him as a visionary. Others saw him as a man lost in his own theories. His papers, once seized, were eventually reviewed by government officials, including a young electrical engineer named John G. Trump, who concluded that they contained nothing of military value. As the boundaries between documented science and speculative possibility continued to blur, the story began to shift away from machines and experiments and towards something more elusive. Written accounts, personal testimonies, and the growing belief that the official history had left something out. Tesla's legacy had already planted the idea that technology could be suppressed or misunderstood, and in the years that followed, attention turned to others who claimed that the government had gone even further. The next chapter didn't begin with a breakthrough in a lab or a public demonstration. It began with a letter that suggested the truth might be hidden not in what was known, but in what was deliberately concealed from the public. Morris Ketchum Jessup was born in Indiana in 1900. He studied astronomy at the University of Michigan, earning both a bachelor's and a master's degree. He began doctoral work in astrophysics, but left the program before completing. Though often referred to as Dr. Jessup, he never actually held a PhD. In the early 1930s and 1940s, Jessup worked in a range of scientific and technical roles. He participated in archaeological expeditions in South America, served as a photographer for research teams, and held jobs in automotive parts sales and technical writing. His background was grounded in observational science, but his interests were shifting. By the early 1950s, Jessup had become increasingly focused on unidentified flying objects. He began corresponding with amateur researchers, eyewitnesses, and fringe theorists. He was drawn to the idea that UFOs might not be fantasy or misidentification, but rather evidence of advanced technologies, even the possibility of extraterrestrials. In 1955, Jessup published The Case for the UFO. The book examined aerial phenomenon through a scientific lens, but also ventured into speculation. He questioned why mainstream science dismissed UFO sightings and suggested that ancient monuments might be linked to forgotten technologies. He proposed that some UFOs could be solid craft, others energy-based, and that their behavior might reflect a deeper understanding of physics than humans currently possessed. The book gained traction in UFO circles and made Jessup a central figure in the growing community of civilian researchers. Not long after this book was published, Morris Jessup received a letter from a man identifying himself as Carlos Miguel Allende. The handwriting was very erratic and the punctuation was unconventional, but the tone was urgent. The return address traced back to Carl Meredith Allen, a former merchant marine with no formal scientific background, but a mind steeped in speculation. Allen claimed that Jessup's book had brushed up against something dangerous. He warned that the ideas Jessup had explored, particularly those involving electromagnetic fields and unexplained aerial phenomena, weren't just theoretical. According to Allen, they had already been tested. He insisted that the government had conducted secret experiments based on Einstein's unpublished work on unified field theory, and that the results were catastrophic. Over the next year, Jessup received multiple letters from Allen, each one expanding on the story, referencing advanced physics, classified research, and a man named Franklin Reno, allegedly a Navy scientist involved in the experiments. Allen's writing was disjointed, but he claimed to have witnessed something that defied explanation and warned Jessup not to dig deeper. Carl Allen said that he was aboard the SS Andrew Forsyth, a merchant marine vessel docked near the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in late October 1943. From the deck, he claimed to have witnessed something that defied every known law of physics. A Navy destroyer escort, the USS Eldridge, was being prepared for a classified test. The goal, according to Allen, was invisibility, not radar evasion or optical camouflage, but a literal disappearance. Allen said when they started the test, the ship was surrounded by a strange field. The air shimmered, tinted green, vibrating with a low hum that seemed to pulse through the harbor. Then, without warning, the Eldridge vanished. Not faded, not cloaked, but gone. Allen insisted that it wasn't just invisible, but it had left the physical space entirely. Next, Allen claimed that during the minutes the Eldridge was absent from Philadelphia, it was seen in Norfolk, Virginia. He described how merchant mariners and dock workers at the Norfolk yard noticed the sudden arrival of a Navy vessel that hadn't been scheduled, surrounded by a faint green mist that seemed to ripple across the water. Confusion spread among those near the ship that lingered without communication, its crew unseen, its presence completely unexplained. But before anybody could approach or make sense of what they were witnessing, the vessel vanished just as abruptly as it had appeared. Allen insisted that this wasn't misidentification or rumor, but it was a physical relocation, a momentary displacement that defied conventional understanding of time and space. Minutes passed. Then the ship returned, but something was wrong. The crew didn't behave like men who had simply endured a blackout. Allen said they staggered across the deck, confused and nauseated. Some collapsed. Some stood motionless, wide-eyed, unresponsive. and a few were missing altogether. And then there were the ones who hadn't come back whole. Allen described sailors fused into the metal of the ship, arms embedded in the bulkheads, legs protruding from steel decks, torsos trapped inside solid walls. He claimed they were still alive when this happened. Some screamed, others were incapable. The Navy, he said, was absolutely horrified. The experiment had worked, but not in the way that they intended. According to Allen, the test was based on a re-examination of Einstein's unified field theory. He claimed that the Navy scientist named Franklin Reno had recalculated the equations, creating a field that could bend space and time. The Eldridge hadn't just disappeared. It had actually teleported. Allen said that the ship reappeared in Norfolk, Virginia before returning to Philadelphia. The transition, he wrote, tore the crew's bodies and minds. Next, he claimed that the Navy tried again, a second test, and this time the ship vanished even longer. When it returned, the effects were way worse. Some crew members were said to have gone mad. Others became physically unstable, phasing in and out of visibility, unable to stay anchored in space. One man reportedly walked through a wall and couldn't get back. Another faded entirely from view and never returned. Allen insisted the Navy shut it down. The project was buried and the witnesses were silenced. Records were destroyed. He warned Jessup that the unified field theory wasn't just theoretical, but it had been weaponized and the consequences were irreversible. It was during that period that the Office of Naval Research received a copy of the case for the UFO, mailed anonymously and marked with 3 distinct sets of hand marks. The margins were dense with commentary, technical corrections, speculative physics, and direct references to experiments that Allen had described. The ink varied in color and the tone shifted between clinical and conspiratorial. Whoever had annotated the book wasn't just responding to Jessup's ideas. They were expanding them, challenging them, and in some places, claiming firsthand knowledge. Jessup was immediately contacted by the ONR and asked to examine the book. He recognized one of the handwritings immediately, the phrasing, the punctuation, the terminology. It was Allen. The same voice that had warned him not to dig deeper was now embedded in the pages of his own work, surrounded by 2 others whose identities were never confirmed, but some speculate it was Allen as well. The Navy didn't dismiss it. They passed the book on to Vero Manufacturing Company, a defense contractor in Texas, and commissioned a limited monography edition. The annotations were preserved exactly as they had arrived. Jessup was given one of these copies and he studied it closely. The margins weren't just commentary, it was more like they were a conversation. The voices debated on propulsion systems, corrected his assumptions, and described the Philadelphia experiment with a level of detail that suggested direct involvement. The Vero edition wasn't released publicly, but it did circulate quietly among researchers and officials, its pages filled with cryptic language and technical warnings. Jessup kept his copy close, and he returned to it often, tracing the logic, trying to understand what had happened to the Eldridge and why someone had gone through such lengths to make sure that he saw it. As Jessup combed through the marked pages, one phrase stopped him cold. It hadn't appeared in Allen's letter, and it wasn't a part of his own research, but there it was, wedged between technical jargon and references to electromagnetic distortion. Project Rainbow. The name wasn't really explained or defined, but the way it was used, just casually as if it were common knowledge, made it clear that it wasn't just a theory. The notes described a Navy initiative that had outfitted the USS Eldridge with specialized equipment, including massive generators, field coils, and configurations built around a reworked version of Einstein's unified field theory. The goal, according to the commentary, was to bend light and electromagnetic energy around the ship's hull, making it invisible to both radar and the naked eye. Jessup hadn't written about this, he hadn't even considered it. But The writing treated the experiment as if it were fact. They described the whole setup and the intended outcome, as well as the catastrophic results. There were no names attached to Project Rainbow, no exact dates or locations, just fragmented speeches that aligned with what Allen had claimed. Men trapped in steel, bodies torn apart, and minds utterly shattered. After the Varro edition was reproduced, Jessup's behavior began to change. He stopped working on new material and started spending long stretches alone, reviewing the notes line by line as if he were trying to decode it. The handwriting, the phrasing, the technical references, they weren't just random. He believed that they were meant to tell him something and him alone. He began to reach out to contacts in broadcasting and publishing, but this time it wasn't to pitch ideas, it was to warn them. He spoke about electromagnetic fields and the dangers of manipulating time and space. And he had become obsessed with the idea of Project Rainbow. He provided no proof and claimed no first-hand experience, but he was certain that the experiment had occurred and believed that someone had made sure that he had grasped its impact. This obsession began to unravel his personal life. He stopped performing lectures, he stopped manuscripts. He moved frequently, leaving behind stacks of notes and correspondences. He gave away copies of the alternate Varro edition of his book to people that he trusted, along with instructions to keep the book safe. By early 1959, Jessup had begun writing farewell letters. They weren't very long and were only sent to a handful of colleagues who followed his work. He turned over his research, boxed up his files, and left behind the materials that he had spent years compiling. On April 20th, he was found inside his car in the Matheson Hammock parking lot of Coral Gables. The engine was running, and a hose had been attached to the exhaust which fed through the window. The doors were locked, and the coroner ruled it a suicide. There was no note in the vehicle, but several people had already received their goodbyes. On the other hand, Carl Allen was difficult to pin down. He used multiple different names, including Carlos Miguel Allende, Carl Allen By, and sometimes just C. Allen. And his letters came from different addresses across Texas and Pennsylvania. He never stayed in one place very long. Born in 1925, he served in the Merchant Marine during World War II and claimed to have witnessed the Philadelphia experiment aboard the S. Andrew Forsyth. That part of his story never changed. He said that he saw the USS Eldridge vanish, reappear, and leave its crew broken, but everything else around him was rather unstable. He had no formal scientific background and wasn't affiliated with any institution, but his letters were filled with technical languages, references to Einstein's unified field theory, and claims about a man named Franklin Reno, a physicist Allen claimed to recalculate the theory for military use. The tone of his writings also shifted constantly. Some letters were calm and methodical, and others were frantic, filled with warnings and corrections, and he often contradicted himself. He would apologize for misleading Jessup and then double down on his claims. He referenced private conversations with scientists, hinted at suppressed research, and insisted that the Navy had buried the results. To make things even weirder, Allen never asked for money and he didn't seek publicity. In fact, he never even attempted to publish his own story. He sent the letters directly to Jessup, addressing him formally, and treated the correspondence as urgent. He believed Jessup's book had touched on something real, something dangerous, and he wanted to make sure that the author understood what he had missed. When the annotated copy of the case for the UFO arrived at the Office of Naval Research, Jessup recognized Allen's handwriting immediately. Everything about it matched, from the phrasing, the punctuation, and the references. Years later, as researchers tried to track Allen down, he was found living in Arizona. Then later in Colorado, where he died in a nursing home in 1994. He never retracted his story, he never clarified his role, and he never explained why he had chosen Jessup. But the letters had continued to come, and the name Carl Allen stayed attached to one of the strangest claims in military history. The United States Navy addressed the allegations regarding the Philadelphia experiment with a measured and straightforward response. As the story began to circulate, first through Jessup's correspondence with Carl Allen, and then through the Virgo edition of the Case for the UFO, officials at the Office of Naval Research were contacted repeatedly for comment. The Navy always maintained a consistent position. They stated that no such experiment had ever been conducted, and that there had been no attempt to render a ship invisible, no manipulation of electromagnetic fields for the purpose of teleportation, and no project resembling whatsoever what Allen had described. The Navy didn't treat the matter as classified information. They treated it as complete and total fiction. Inquiries were directed at the Naval History and Heritage Command, which maintains the official deck logs and movement records of all commissioned vessels. The USS Eldridge, a Cannon-class destroyer escort, was commissioned in August 1943 and assigned to a convoy duty in the Atlantic. According to its logs, the Eldridge wasn't even in Philadelphia on the date Allen claimed the experiment took place. Instead, the ship was operating out of New York and later Bermuda, conducting routine escort missions for Allied supplied convoys. The records show no gaps in movement, no unexplained transfers, and no indication of any sort of unusual activity. Every departure and arrival was logged. Every crew rotation was documented, and the ship's itinerary was constantly within standard naval operations during wartime. The Navy also addressed the technical claims made by the letters and the marked-up Jessup book. The idea that a destroyer escort could have been made invisible through electromagnetic field manipulation was dismissed outright, because the technology required to achieve such an effect didn't exist in 1943. The unified field theory referenced by Allen had not been completed or even published by Einstein, and at the time, no known physicist had developed a working model capable of producing the results described. To this day, the Navy has emphasized that the concept of teleportation remains theoretical and limited to quantum-scale phenomenon. There is no known method for displacing a physical object of that size across space without violating the laws of physics. Beyond the technical and logistic rebuttals, the Navy pointed to the absence of credible witnesses. Allen claimed to have observed the experiment from aboard the SS Andrew Forsyth, a merchant vessel operating in the same region. However, no other crew members from that ship ever came forward to corroborate his story. There were no reports filed. There were no statements recorded. No documentation of any kind that supported Allen's claim. The story relied entirely on Allen's letters, which were inconsistent and often contradictory. He changed details over time, revised dates, and occasionally retracted parts of his own narrative. Researchers who attempted to interview him found him very evasive. He refused to clarify key points and often redirected conversation towards unrelated topics. The annotated book sent to the Office of Naval Research was reviewed internally but never treated as actual evidence. It was reproduced by Varro Manufacturing Company at the Navy's request, not as a confirmation of the claims, but more so as a curiosity. The messages in the margins were strange, filled with references to alien propulsion systems and field manipulation, but they lacked coherence. They didn't align with any known research, and they didn't cite any sources, and they didn't prove any framework that could be tested or even verified. In the years following Jessup's death, the Navy continued to receive inquiries about the Philadelphia experiment. Each time, the response remained the same. There had been no such experiment. The Eldridge had followed its assigned duties, the ship's records were intact, and the story, while it was persistent, had no foundation in fact. The Navy didn't even attempt to suppress the claims. They simply pointed to the documentation. The logs were publicly available, the movements were recorded, and the technology described in the letters didn't exist within the scope of Navy research at that time. But the fact is, the Navy was doing experiments that dealt with invisibility, only not in the way one might think. During World War II, the U.S. Navy implemented a process known as degassing across its fleet. The purpose wasn't secrecy or invisibility in the way that Carl Allen had described. It was more defensive. Magnetic mines deployed by enemy forces were designed to detonate when triggered by magnetic signatures of a passing ship. Every vessel carried a natural magnetic field. as a result of its construction and movement through the Earth's geomagnetic environment. That field made ships vulnerable, and degassing was developed to counteract it. The method involved installing a system of electric cables around the hull of the ship, running from bow to stern. These cables carried a controlled electric current that generated a magnetic field opposite to the ship's own. When calibrated correctly, the two fields would cancel each other out, effectively neutralizing the ship's magnetic footprint. The result wasn't invisibility in the visual sense, but a form of concealment from magnetic detection systems. Mines calibrated to respond to magnetic anomalies would fail to trigger, and the ship would be able to pass undetected. The USS Eldridge, like many destroyer escorts of its class, was equipped with degassing coils. The installation was standard and the procedures were all routine, but the equipment itself was large, complex, and unfamiliar to many of the sailors who served aboard. The process required calibration, testing, and occasional recalibration depending on the ship's location and heading. When active, the coils could produce a notable hum, and in some cases, they caused interference with onboard electronics. Crew members unfamiliar with the system sometimes speculated about its purpose, especially when paired with other wartime technologies like radar and sonar. The confusions likely began with observations. Ships undergoing degassing procedures were sometimes surrounded by technicians, cables, and unfamiliar equipment. The process could involve temporarily rerouting of power, changes in the lighting, and restricted areas to certain compartments. To an outsider, or even to a crew member not briefed on the specifics, it might look as if something more advanced or experimental was happening. Carl Allen claimed to have witnessed the Eldridge vanish from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. He said that the ship reappeared in Norfolk, Virginia, and then returned, with crew members suffering from severe physical and psychological trauma. But the Navy ship's records show no such events. What they do show are ships undergoing standard outfitting procedures, including the installation and testing of degassing equipment. And if Allen had observed a ship during one of those procedures, especially from a distance without any understanding of what he's seeing, then it is entirely possible that he misinterpreted the activity. Terminology may have been another contributing factor. Degassing isn't a word that most civilians would recognize, and it sounds technical, obscure, but vaguely ominous. In the context of wartime secrecy, it could have easily been misunderstood. But overall, degassing wasn't a secret. The Navy had implemented it across the fleet as a standard defense measure, and its purpose was well understood by those trained to operate and maintain the equipment. But for those already primed to believe in suppressed research or classified experiments, the presence of electromagnetic gear and field manipulation could easily be interpreted as evidence of something else. Without access to technical documentations or first-hand experience, the distinction between a defense system and a groundbreaking experiment could become quite easily blurred. And once that confusion took hold, it became difficult to separate what had actually happened from what people thought that they had seen. Long after the story of the Philadelphia experiment had faded from headlines and official statements, a new set of claims began to surface, ones that didn't come from naval archives or wartime correspondences, but from a decommissioned military site on the eastern tip of Long Island. The location was Camp Hero, a former Air Force station in Montauk, New York. The claims came from a man named Preston B. Nicholas, who said that beneath the abandoned radar towers and crumbling bunkers, a secret program had taken place, one that he called the Montauk Project. Nicholas described a series of experiments that allegedly began in the 1970s, focused on psychological manipulation, electromagnetic field control, and eventually, time travel. He claimed that the research conducted at Montauk was a direct continuation of the Philadelphia experiment, that the original test in 1943 had opened something, and that Montauk had been built to study and exploit whatever that was. According to Nicholas, the government had spent decades trying to understand the effects of the original experiment, and Camp Hero had become central of that effort. He detailed the use of a device called the Montauk chair, which he said could amplify psychic abilities through electromagnetic fields. He described the experiments involving sensory isolation, telepathic projections, and the manipulation of thought. He claimed that children were abducted and subjected to conditioning, and that some of these experiments resulted in physical displacements of time. The connection to the Philadelphia experiment came through a man named Al Bielek, who Nicholas said had been aboard the USS Eldridge during the original tests. Bielek later claimed to recover suppressed memories of his involvement in both projects and described being part of the program that spanned over decades. However, none of these claims have been supported by physical evidence. The U.S. government has denied any involvement in the Montauk Project, and no official documentation has surfaced to confirm the existence of the experiments Nicholas described. Camp Hero was decommissioned in the late 1960s, and while the site has drawn the attention of conspiracy theorists and paranormal investigators, no verifiable records link it to any kind of research outlined in Nicholas's book. Despite the lack of documentation, though, the claims created a narrative bridge between the two stories that had previously stood apart. The Philadelphia experiments, once confined to a single ship in a single moment, was now a part of something larger. And while every detail linking the two projects became a personal testimony rather than an archived record, the idea of a long-running program focused on time manipulation and electromagnetic control gave the original story a new dimension. Alfred D. Bielek was born in 1927, raised in California. He had built a career in electronics, working with military contractors on radar systems and advanced communications. Technically skilled and well-versed in electromagnetic theory, he spent decades in defense-related industries without attracting public attention. He wasn't a researcher or a public feature, and his name didn't appear in any official records tied to classified programs. For most of his life, he was known as a simple, quiet, competent engineer. But that all changed in the late 1980s when Bielek began speaking at conferences focused on fringe science and government secrecies. He presented himself not just as a technician, but as someone with first-hand knowledge of events that had long been considered speculative. His background in electronics gave him credibility among audiences drawn to stories of suppressed technology and experimental physics, and he quickly became a central figure in the growing community surrounding the Philadelphia experiment as well as the Montauk Project. Al Bielek's account of his involvement in both the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk Project emerged publicly in the late 1980s, decades after the original claims surrounding the USS Eldridge had circulated. According to Bielek, his connection to these events began in 1943, though he asserted he had no memory of it until much later. He claimed that his true identity was Edward Cameron, a Navy officer assigned to the Eldridge during the time of the experiment. The name, Al Bielek, he said, was the result of a government program that had forcibly age-regressed and reinserted him into society under a new identity to suppress his memories and protect the integrity of the timeline. Bielek described the Philadelphia experiment as a test of radar invisibility conducted under Project Rainbow. He said that the ship had been outfitted with electromagnetic field generators based on theoretical work by Nikola Tesla and John von Neumann, with Albert Einstein serving as an advisor. The goal, according to Bielek, was to bend light and electromagnetic energy around the ship, rendering it invisible to both radar and the human eye. He claimed that the initial tests were successful on a small scale, but when the technology was applied to the Eldridge, the results were utterly catastrophic. He stated that on August 12, 1943, the Eldridge was activated with full power, and the ship disappeared from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Bielek claimed that he and his brother Duncan Cameron were aboard during the test and experienced severe disorientation. He said that when they attempted to escape the chaos by jumping overboard, they didn't land in water, but instead they found themselves in the year 1983 inside a facility at Montauk, New York. This, he said, was the result of a time rift created by the experiment, one that had linked the Eldridge to the Montauk base exactly 40 years later. At Montauk, Bielek claimed that they were taken in by personnel who were already conducting advanced experiments in time travel, teleportation, and psychological manipulation. He said that the Montauk Project had evolved from the original Philadelphia experiment, and that they were using technology derived from it to explore the boundaries of space-time. According to his account, the Montauk chair was a device that amplified psychic abilities through electromagnetic fields and was central to these experiments. Bielek said that he worked as a program director at the facility, overseeing tests that involved telepathic communications, remote viewing, and that created portals of time. He described a series of experiments in which subjects were sent to different time points, including the distant past and the distant future. Bullock claimed to have traveled to the year 2137, where he spent 6 weeks recovering from radiation injuries in a hospital that used vibrational and light-based treatments. He also said that he later spent 2 years in the year 2749, where he witnessed a radically altered Earth with a reduced population and advanced technological infrastructure. These accounts were presented in lectures and interviews, alongside other figures associated with the Montauk narrative, including Preston Nicholas and Duncan Cameron. Bullock maintained that after his time at Montauk, he returned to 1943, where he was forcibly removed from the timeline, age regressed to infancy, and then replaced with the Bullock family in 1927, following the death of their biological child. He said that this had been done to preserve the timeline and prevent further disruption. His memories, according to him, were suppressed until the late 1980s, when exposure to the 1984 film The Philadelphia Experiment triggered a flood of recollections. He began speaking publicly soon after, detailing his experiences and asserting that the government had gone through great length to conceal the actual truth. Of course, there is no official documentation to support Bullock's claims. Naval records do not list an Edward Cameron aboard the USS Eldridge, and there is no evidence that Camp Hero at Montauk was used for this kind of experimentation that he described. The U.S. government has denied any involvement in time travel research, and no physical proof has ever surfaced to verify the existence of the Montauk chair or the psychological conditioning programs Bullock referenced. Nonetheless, his story has become a central part of the lore surrounding both projects, and his detailed accounts continue to be cited in conspiracy lectures and fringe research communities. Throughout the story, the tensions between documented science and speculative testimony. As World War II drew to a close, the public's relationship with the military authorities began to shift. The war had introduced technologies that were previously unimaginable: radar, atomic weapons, jet propulsion, and with them came a growing awareness of the government's capability to developing and deploying systems far beyond the public understanding. Secrecy had been essential to wartime strategies, but in post-war years, that same secrecy began to breed suspicion. People had seen the efforts of classified research without ever being told what was going on or how it worked. And when stories of the Philadelphia experiment surfaced, they didn't seem entirely implausible. They seemed to fit into a broader pattern: advanced technology, hidden operation, and unexplained consequences. The Navy's denial of experiments didn't settle the matter. For many, it just reinforced the idea that something had happened, something too sensitive to acknowledge. The lack of documentation, the absence of reliable witnesses, the inconsistencies in the story didn't disprove any of it. They became a part of it. The gaps were interpreted not as evidence of fabrication, but as signs of a cover-up. And that mindset didn't end with the Philadelphia experiment. Just a few years later, in 1947, the Roswell incident would ignite a new wave of speculation. A crashed object recovered by the military was first described as a flying disc before being reclassified as a weather balloon. The result was swift, and the public's reaction was immediate. The idea that the government was hiding something gained traction, and Roswell became a focal point for the questions about extraterrestrial life, secret technology, and the limits of official disclosure. Philadelphia and Roswell are not the same story, but they share a common thread. Both involved military operations, unexplained phenomenon, and a public increasingly willing to question the official narrative. War had shown that government could keep secrets. The post-war years made people wonder what else they might be keeping. And in that environment, stories like the Philadelphia experiment only multiplied. With its offshoot, Montauk Project, these ideas have left a lasting imprint, not just on conspiracy lore, but on how the public engages with the idea of hidden truths. These stories didn't just survive decades of scrutiny and denial, they've evolved, adapted, and embedded themselves into pop culture in ways that continue to shape how people think about secrecy, science, and authority. Part of this impact lies in timing. The original claims emerged in the shadows of World War II, when the public had just witnessed the unveiling of technologies like the atomic bomb, developed in total secrecy and developed without any warning. That revelation changed the public's perception of what governments were capable of hiding, and suddenly, the idea that a ship could be made invisible or that time travel might actually be possible didn't feel entirely out of reach. It felt like something that could be buried beneath layers of classification and plausible deniability. These ideas offered framework where gaps in official narratives became invitations to imagine what's missing. And when those stories are told with technical language, military settings, and just enough history overlap, they gain the kind of credibility that's hard to dismiss outright. Popular culture has only amplified that effect. In the 1984 film The Philadelphia Experiment, it introduced a story to mainstream audiences, blending science fiction with government secrecy and time displacement. Of course, this wasn't a documentary, and it never claimed to be, but it gave visual form to a myth that had previously lived in letters and fringe publications. Later, the Montauk Project would inspire Stranger Things, a series that borrowed heavily from the idea of secret experiments conducted on children in remote military facilities. Even Marvel's Loki included a nod to the USS Eldridge, teleporting it into a void as part of a time warp narrative. Now, these references do not claim original claims, but they do illustrate an ongoing interest in the idea that reality may be more complex than commonly believed. The Philadelphia Experiment is frequently cited as an example of narratives that challenge established accounts of historical events. And as long as there's a gap between what's documented and what's imagined, stories like this will continue to thrive. Proof is not required. What is necessary is the demonstration of potential. Philadelphia Experiment has survived not because of what was proven. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It survived because of what was never fully explained. The official records are very clear, and the Navy's position has been unwavering this entire time. And to this day, the science behind these alleged events remains unsupported. And yet the story continues, passed through letters, interviews, and decades of speculations. It's been retold in books, dramatized in films, and echoed in the architecture of other conspiracies, each retelling adding a new layer. And that's where the question lingers. Was it a hoax, born from misinterpretation and embellished over time? Was it a cover-up, buried beneath layers of denial and redirection? Or was it something else entirely? An event so far outside conventional understanding that it resists classification. We stand on the edge of understanding, where science meets speculation and where yesterday's secrets may yet become tomorrow's revelations. Perhaps the allure isn't in the answers, but in the pursuit itself, that the idea of something extraordinary might lie just beyond we can measure or explain. Until next time, I'm Amanda Joy. May your curiosity guide your journey, and may the unknown always whisper just loud enough to keep you listening. Follow the path even further. If this episode left you lingering in the shadows, there's more to explore. Follow @Down the Crooked Path on TikTok and Instagram for haunting visuals, behind-the-scenes lore, and updates on upcoming episodes. Every post is another breadcrumb deeper into the strange, the forgotten, and the beautifully unsettling. Stay curious and keep walking the path.